there's a point early in the book, the men are kind of happy because they're under French command, so they're getting French rations, and that comes with a little bit of wine and some cognac. But that has to go away because the officers don't want to hear from the Women's Temperance League that their young men are being corrupted with alcohol.
Oh, I forgot about that one. Yeah, that is.
So you have these. It's perfectly fine for these young men to be maimed and tortured and killed, but God forbid that they do it a little sauced.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, because that you do see that contrast. I forgot about that, because this would have been, right before Prohibition kicks off. And I guess the French are also, like, from an American perspective, especially at this point in time, much more loose with their morality. So.
Oh, definitely, and I think especially the the French prostitutes part of the book. That's very that was very risky and for March to put in, and but at the same time, there's a reason that this book was so popular at the time, and it's a real shame that it's since fallen out of print, and yeah, it just I didn't know about it for the longest time until I just happened upon it, more or less. So the war ends, and the men who can return home do return home. But even there's no peace for them.
Yeah, and I
Right.
think this is another point where I think March's book stands out amongst some other literature of the same time period, especially written about the First World War, is that you actually you really see the how the war sort of impacts each individual person differently. And for some of these men, right, you see that they just move on with their lives. They get jobs, they get married or whatever. But you also get to see, for some of these men, they can never shake the events that basically shape them for the rest of their life.
There's one little vignette that I think probably hit me harder than all the others. Towards the end of the book, it's Private Walter Webster, and the gist of it is, and we talked about this a little bit in our DMs, but the gist of it is he was betrothed to this woman, Effie, right? And there was a lot of romance around the beginning of the war. She basically promised to marry him if he enlisted, and they would get married when he returned. And he does return, but he's badly mutilated. He's burned. His face is almost unrecognizable, right? He doesn't look human, and he's stubborn, and he's bitter that she wants to call the wedding off, right? But he's also it's not so much bitterness, but also just this I hate to use the word pathetic, but he's holding on to this idea, like, because it's clear that he very much loves this woman and needs to marry her to make everything that he's been through kind of worth it. And they go through with it. He doesn't let her out of the promise. She can't bear to look at him. She can't bear to touch him or be touched by him. And it ends on this somber note of, what have I done? I should just be dead.
Yeah, that one hit me hard, especially, because it ends that last ending paragraph where he lays his head in her lap, and he describes it, if I remember correctly. He says something about he could tell her repulsion by, like, the rigidity of the muscles in her legs, right? So he, like, lays his head on her lap, and she's so repulsed by him she can't even relax. And then he makes that comment about all he wanted her to do was tell him it's going to be okay, or something.
And all she says in return, like, all she can say is, "If you touch me, I'll vomit," she said. And that's the end. That's the end of the story right there.
Yeah. And I think that story hits you hard, and that ending part really kind of, if somebody's going into this book and they were wanting to know what it's like, I'd say you're going to get hit like that in the gut a lot
every time. Yep.
you
Whether it's, that lieutenant who's sending the men out, and then he's like, I didn't know this, like, I couldn't have known, or whether it's, the men killing the prisoners.
Right. And, to get back to that story, because I do think that one's important, because in my research, what I had found was like that was actually the first thing that March wrote that would become this book itself.
Mm,
Right. Is I think he actually wrote it as, like, if I remember correctly, sort of like a serial.
mhm.
And I don't know if he submitted to somebody or what, but somebody kind of had told him, like, "Yeah, this is too much," right? And then he decides to, do the whole book that way. But that story, I think, speaking of how this would have been difficult for Americans to digest, that narrative, which is, I think, goes across like 4 or 5 different soldiers' perspectives, um, is would have been difficult for Americans to understand that, like, yeah, these guys just murdered these German prisoners because they just wanted to. Really, the lieutenant wanted to. He didn't want to carry them around, and they kind of make excuses for why they do it, right? But I think that would have been really hard to digest, to realize, like, hey, these soldiers aren't the shining beacon of hope you thought they were.
So to go back to the first chapter with Private Delaney, right? I found the part that I wanted to bring up, where he's talking to his wife, and this is the stand-in for March, and so you get this right away in the book, right? Um, we'd been silent for a time, and then my wife spoke. I'd take out the part about shooting prisoners. Why? I asked. Because it's cruel and unjust to shoot defenseless men in cold blood. It may have been done a few times, I'm not denying that, but it isn't typical. It couldn't have happened often. Would a description of an air raid be better? I asked. Would that be more humane? Would that be more typical? Yes, she said. Yes, that happened many times, I understand. Is it crueler, then, for Captain Matlock to order prisoners shot because he was merely stupid and thought the circumstances warranted that, than for an aviator to bomb a town and kill harmless people who are not even fighting him? That isn't as revolting as shooting prisoners, said my wife stubbornly. Then she added, You see, the aviator can't see where his bomb strikes or what it does, so he's not really responsible. But the men in your story had the prisoners actually before them. It's not the same thing at all. So you have this kind of twisted logic, but it also makes sense in a way,
Yeah.
for especially for people who haven't been there. They don't want stories. They don't want reality.
Mhm.
It reminds me of that Stalin quote. One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, sort of thing. Like, the further away you can get from the reality on the ground, the easier it is to digest and to understand. Which is also one of the reasons I think drone warfare is so kind of pernicious and awful.
Yeah, or because it takes the responsibility off of all the parties involved, well, except for the people getting bombed, right? And
Right.
it becomes easier, and it becomes more sanitized. And in some ways, this is echoed too in another one of these stories in the book, where I forget which private it is, but he's talking. He's basically a sniper or sharpshooter, and
That's right. Yes.
right, and I think he kills 9 out of 12 Germans, like, with one shot, and he's kind of bragging about it. And then he has this moment where he steps back and he says, if they were something about, basically, if there was a race of little people no bigger than your thumb, even the nicest person in the world would have no problem basically stepping on them, right?
Right. Right. And then they talk about Jonathan Swift and uh, Gulliver's Travels. Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point too. It's like the sniper is.
But yeah, you see that, you see even with the soldier that proclivity to try to excuse what he's doing by turning his target to not being human. Right.
Right. He needs to dehumanize them, and he gets commended. I think I think the only mention of like a general officer in the book is that a general comes to see him work, in sort of macabre terms, and I think he gets a medal even for the 9 out of 12 that he gets.
Well, you know how you said you know how you said that Private Delaney is a stand-in for March.
Mm-hmm.
I had read, in my research, I found a few, because this book is not talked about a lot. If you Google it, you won't find much. But I did find some people who had suggested that there's another stand-in for March again, where, if you remember towards the end, when the runner comes across the German soldier in the forest,
Right,
and they kind of stop and look at each other, because the German soldier's sitting there eating. I think he's eating some bread, and he's unaware of the American watching him. And then when he realizes it, they kind of have a stare off, and then they both go for their guns. And in the ensuing, scuffle, basically, the American ends up, he gets him on his back, and he drives his bayonet through the bottom of his and he can't get the bayonet out. And then he has this reoccurring nightmare where that German soldier is just sitting there in his room all night watching him after he's gotten home from the war.
Right.
And then he ends up having like a conversation with the ghost of this German. Anyways, there's people saying that they thought that was also sort of a stand-in for March as well, because of sort of how his life played out later on, when because he dies in New Orleans, like, alone. And so I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I could see why, because I almost think that the stories where you get where there's a longer narrative and more personal, I almost think that is more of March putting himself in there.
Right. You can tell which stories are sort of the backbone and which are kind of not filler, because I think there's value in every one of these vignettes, and I don't think you could really take anything out without diminishing the book. But there's definitely like, oh, I need to put this in here so that it makes more narrative sense. Here and there, and then there are, like you said, these longer experiences that make up the bulk of the novel. There's also, you kind of see at the end, there's one soldier who we met at the beginning. I think his name is Rowland something. Who we met at the beginning, and he's one of the guys who's like, I could take on the whole army, right? And meanwhile, at the end of the war, he's yelling at the radio because of something, because he's bitter that he's lost use of his legs and his sister has to take care of him.
Mm. Oh, that was him.
Rowland something.
Yeah. It's sometimes, like, when you're reading it, you kind of have to really take note of names to kind of connect that some of these stories are continuations, because I would forget that all the time.
Oh, you know what? Sorry, Rowland. He dies in the bombardment. It's Leslie Yaffwitz or Yaffitz. That's another thing too, is that I bet some of these names have to be real, because speaking from some experience, it's hard for me to imagine names that aren't just like Mike Jones, or Tom Miller, like really basic stuff. There's some real creativity trying to differentiate these men.
I would guess that he probably, and I don't know if it's true, that he mixed the names up. Like, he took one last name and one first name.
I'm guessing, or maybe even like just taking stuff from like newspaper death tolls, or death rolls rather. I think that's very possible, because the one criticism I will levy at the book is a lot of the soldiers just kind of sound the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that could also just be because there's not a lot of time to flesh out characters. He, some of them get less than a page to flesh things out, but there is it does kind of meld together, and maybe that's like you said at the beginning, it's kind of on purpose. It's supposed to be a stand-in for any soldier in any conflict. So it could be, that could have been on purpose. Are there any other vignettes that kind of stand out to you, John, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like when I started taking notes, like okay, I'm gonna write down the ones I like. I ended up with like 15 or 20. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I had
yeah.
to, because there's so many of them that you realize. But if I was gonna go, because there's some at the end, but I think from the beginning. Let's see. We already talked about. Oh, there's one that I want to get your thoughts on this, especially as somebody else who's also a religious man. Do you remember the story of Private Geller and they eat the bread, the blood-soaked bread?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Like that story was hard, like not hard to read, but it was disturbing because essentially what happens is two soldiers come upon a dead German and he's laid across a log on his I think he's laying on his back, right?
Right.
And he's sort of prostrate, which I think there's some symbolism there I want to get to, but he's laid out on his back. They turn him over, they go through his knapsack, and they find a loaf of bread. And the problem is because he's been shot in the front, the blood has drained backwards and it's gone into his pack, and the bread is soaked with blood, right? And at first they're not going to eat it, right? And he goes to throw it away, and the other soldier that's with him, that's with Private Geller, says, "What are you doing? You're going to waste that bread?" And they sit down and they eat this blood-soaked bread.
Yeah.
And while I was reading it, because I reread it before, the other day, and I kept thinking, I don't know if this is intentional by March or not, but the way that he's described to be laying down on his back across a piece of wood is sort of reminiscent of the crucifixion, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then you have sort of this twisted Eucharistic ceremony going on with eating the blood-soaked bread.
It's kind of, yeah. It's like a reverse communion.
Right.
Like they've really they lose something in their humanity there. If communion is sort of, if Holy Communion is literal communion with the divine, then this is the opposite of that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that is, I would imagine it has to be intentional in some capacity. I don't think that that would have been lost on him. But like reading through the second time, I think you make a good point. It's sort of a reverse communion where they're partaking in a level of savagery that maybe, like you said, takes away their humanity. It makes them closer to being animals, because a civilized person shouldn't eat blood-soaked bread regardless of how
Right.
hungry they are.
And they're in they're in, savage animal conditions. You
Hmm.
know, I doubt they're eating much. They might be eating, somewhat well, but even and Remark kind of talks about this in All Quiet on the Western Front. The soldiers get the best rations in Germany. Germany's basically starving at this point, but they don't always eat because the cook might be too afraid to get to the lines.
Mm.
So they scrounge for what they can. And I have to imagine that it's on both sides of no man's land that is occurring. Otherwise, yeah, it would be easy to just throw away some blood-soaked bread. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think that's probably where the key lies. Like they've reached a point where basically that's it. They've lost their humanity, right? They've gotten just close enough to tasting sort of, I guess you'd call it evil, or more of a animalistic nature, that it's almost like a temptation where he's going to throw the bread away. He could throw the bread away. He could deal with being hungry, but his friend, sort of playing the other role, tells him like, "What are you doing? Are you stupid?"
yeah,
And that sort of overrides his more rational faculty, I guess.